Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for being here tonight. As I mentioned, I'm Stesha Brandon, the Literature and Humanities Program Manager at the Seattle Public Library. And as we begin tonight, I would like to acknowledge that we are on Indigenous land. These are the traditional unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish people. We honor their elders past and present and thank them for their stewardship of this land. Welcome to tonight's program with Brandon Hobson and David Heska Wanbley Wyden, presented in partnership with Elliott Bay Book Company. We would like to thank Author Series sponsor Gary Kunis and the Seattle Times for generous support of library programs. Finally, we're grateful to the Seattle Public Library Foundation. Private gifts to the foundation from thousands of donors help the library provide free programs and services that touch the lives of everyone in our community. I have just a couple quick announcements before we get started. First, the wonderful folks at Elliott Bay Books have copies of both Brandon and David's books available for sale, and I heard it on good authority that they also have signed book plates from both authors as well. So Elliott Bay is open for limited browsing or for curbside pickup or delivery, and you can order Brandon or David's books or both from their website, elliottbaybook.com. And if you want a signed book plate, you can put that in the order when you place your order. I also wanted to let you know that toward the end of the conversation, we'll have time for your questions, and you can type your questions in the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen at any time during the program. Now I am delighted to welcome Rick Simonson from Elliott Bay Book Company, who is going to introduce tonight's speakers. Hi, Rick.
Hi, Stesha. Thank you for that, and thank you everyone who has joined us. And for those of you who've joined us who do know the usual format, when Elliott Bay has been co-presenting, doing a program at the literally at the library, to know we have sort of a routine of that, and part of what Stesh has just done has been very much like that, except without various announcements about what time the library closed. And anyway, we're also watching people file in literally too. So this is a different, all this is very different for all the familiarity. And to say it is a great pleasure to be part of this evening. And for, in fact, both of our writers who are here tonight, I don't think, we were chatting a little beforehand with David, he's never seen the library, but Stesh's backdrop is a part of the library, but not the part we would be in were we doing this there. We'd be probably in the auditorium. Tonight, you're going to hear from two extraordinary writers. The evening is occasioned by the publication of Brandon Hobson's new novel, The Removed, which has just come out. And he will be joined in conversation by David Heska Wanbley Wyden, who is the author of Winter Counts, a book that came out in this last year. I'll say a little bit more about that as we go along. But I'll go back to Brandon's book first. Brandon Hobson is the author of 3 previous books before this, the most recent of which, Where the Dead Sit Talking, was 2018 National Book Award finalist. Brandon is here. He's actually here joining us from Las Cruces, where he's a professor of creative writing at the University, or New Mexico State University, as the one in Las Cruces. He's also teaches in the MFA program at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe. He has written in this new book, this powerful book. The Removed is a book that, and you're going to hear a lot more said better as the evening goes along by both Brandon and by David, but it is set in Cherokee country in what is also known as Oklahoma, and tells a story of a family that has been marked by trauma and what happens with that over time, and certain things within the family, but within the larger community where they are, and what kind of gets amplified and ripples in a way to powerful effect, which I don't want to even give it away kind of thing, because it does quite extraordinary things. So you will hear of that as the evening goes along, and certainly as you read it when that time comes. And joining him, David Heska Wanbley Wyden, who is joining us from Denver, where he teaches at Metropolitan State University. And I mentioned that David's the author of Winter Counts. He's one of the writers whose first books were published, at the inopportune time of this last year's pandemic, and yet, though I suppose any book published in this period could have done better or found more readers, His novel, which tells a harrowing and a haunted story kind of set in the Rosebud Reservation, or there and between there and Denver. And that has found a readership. And we're going to work on this because this book's coming out in later in the year in paperback, and maybe we'll and he has some Seattle connections, so we'll see. Maybe he'll physically get here for that, but we'll do something more with that. David his background also includes being a lawyer. He's not only doing literature, has done law, but I don't believe the law is happening so much now. He is a Chikungo Lakota writer who and draws on that I would call background. It is his being in this book. It's drawn strongly within Chikungo Lakota terrain and culture. So that may come up a little bit tonight, but if it doesn't come up enough, we'll work on that another night. So I think I will disappear here as I end my words, but to say for all of you who have joined us, you're in for a pleasurable evening. It should be a very engaging one, as Brandon Hobson and David Heska Wombley Wyden talk about The Removed and touch on winter counts. And Stash, I think, will come back at the end and help close the evening out. And again, as she mentioned, please feel free to put questions in the chat as the evening goes along, or in the Q&A, I'm sorry. And you'll get questions heard and read. Take care. Thank you very much. And now please welcome Brandon Hobson and David Heska Wombley Wyden.
Well, Rick, thank you. I'll go first here. Thank you, Rick, and thank you, Stesha, and thank you, Seattle, and everyone for inviting us. It is really such a pleasure and an honor to be here. And it's my pleasure and honor to be here with my friend, Brandon Hobson. Now, I had the distinct honor of reading an early version of this book, and it is stunning. Okay, I mean, there's really no other word. In fact, I think I called it astonishing, and you can read my words on it. It is a book that is going to be talked about for a long time. It is a book that is going to become part of the canon of Native American literature. It is an important book. It is a wonderfully readable book. It is a book that sticks with you. It is a book that borrows from, Cherokee tradition. It's a book that has amazing characters. It's a book that you just can't put down. And so it is just, wonderful to be here to celebrate the publication of this astonishing book. So I'm going to shut up here because I want to hear what Brandon has to say. We have half an hour or so to talk about a few things, and we're going to talk about some things within the book. But he and I decided ahead of time that maybe what we do is we kind of like to situate for all of the viewers out there sort of the concept of Native American literature. And we want to start big, and then we're going to work our way in and get a little more detailed on the book. So Brandon, I'm going to start off with sort of a larger view question from the skies here. Here's the question. What do non-Native readers expect? Non-Native readers, what do they expect from what's considered to be Native literature today? Can you kind of talk about that and tell us a little bit?
Thanks, Dave. And thanks, Rick. Thanks, Stesha, for having me and for having Dave tonight. It's really an honor to be here. I love Seattle. I've only been there once, but I loved it. And thanks everybody for showing up tonight. This question that Dave is asking about what non-Native readers expect of Native literature, I think is a very, very important question that is talked about. And it's especially talked about and discussed in universities all around the world, honestly. And anybody studying literature, American literature, often comes to this term of what is Native American literature, right? Does it mean it's literature just simply written by a Native American writer, or does it mean something else, right? And I think it can become a little bit problematic in that non-Native readers often want to lump all Native American literature into one specific category and not really talk about the diverse tribes. Dave and I are part of different tribes, right? And each tribe has their own stories to tell. And so, at some point it would be interesting to really be able to focus on how many different specific tribal writers are out there, right? And talking about specifically different stories. I think, but to go back to the question itself, is Santee Frazier and I were talking about this last night, as a matter of fact, and one point that he brought up I thought was really fascinating was, if we read Shakespeare, if we read Hamlet, for example, and at the beginning we see a ghost, and it's the ghost of Hamlet's father appears at the beginning of Hamlet, right? And often Shakespeare used ghosts a lot, but in a book in Native Lit, if you use a ghost or a spirit, right, I think readers are looking or expecting something different than they're not expecting with Shakespeare. And we've fallen into this sort of colonization, right, way of thinking, a culture of colonization that wants people to sort of dictate this is exactly what Native Lit is supposed to be. This is the voice that, or this is what you can and can't talk about. Those kinds of questions, I think, are explored, throughout the college classroom, all the time. And it's a big, difficult question that I don't know that the collective everyone has come up with an answer yet. But I do think we're headed in the right direction, in that now we're not seeing, in terms of other art forms, we're not seeing the cliched, wild, savage Indian as much as, Hollywood is absolutely the worst. And Dave and I have talked about this, we talked about this just recently, last week, portraying a Native person, as sort of wild or savage, and not really exploring enough stories of, the urban Native. And our friend Tommy Orange in his book There, talks a little bit more about Indians in cities and the urban Indian and all around us. And this becomes just a very big discussion and a very big question that I don't know that we've really decided yet. I mean, Dave, you're a professor there at Metro State, and what do your students seem to do, or do they just sort of look to you as the sort of the expert to tell them, or do they already have these sort of preconceived notions about what Native American literature is?
Well, I have to kind of duck that question because I am not actually a professor of Native American literature or literature at all. So I am a professor. I'm a professor of Native American studies. And so although, And so although we do have a class on Native American literature, that is the domain of the English department. So I'm actually in the social sciences. So when I teach my students, it is more about larger issues like the broken criminal justice system, healthcare system, legal stuff. I personally would love to teach literature, but they're not going to let me. So so my students, we don't really. It doesn't come up that much. But let me follow up, because you said something that really kind of piqued my interest here. I want to pull something out here. Another question. Tell me about how colonization plays a role in dictating, what's considered literature and what isn't. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that? Because you kind of mentioned that. I'm very intrigued by that.
Yeah, it's so weird, right? It's so difficult to answer that. And I think generally what we see is that non-native readers want to see the sort of secretive ceremonial stuff, right? Or that they see what, we're sort of lumped into this cliche of we have to talk about, we have to have talking animals. We have to have, you know, spiritual stuff. There's things that we can and we cannot talk about, obviously, but there seems to be, you know, this sort of hokiness, you know, that I think that non-native readers are drawn to. I don't know if you would agree with that, you know, that it falls into what we really want to avoid is in stereotyping the literature and you know, everything about it.
Yeah, the stereotype thing is tough. So in Winter Counts, and you and I probably talked about this 6 months ago.
Yeah.
I made a conscious decision that my protagonist, Virgil Wounded Horse, would not be an alcoholic. Okay. You know, substance abuse, is it a problem on my reservation? Yes, as it is in every corner of American society. But I just felt that I wasn't going to feed into that stereotype. So my character, Virgil Wounded Horse, I allude to the fact that he has had a problem with substances in the past, but he never takes a drink in the book. You know, so the stereotypes and, you know, everything that you bring up, you know, it is something that we have to grapple with. A native writer, when we sit down at the keyboard, we have to decide how, you know, how far are we going to go in these issues? You know, how much are we going to share? And also, how much do we have to explain? This is something that I really, you know, struggled with. I use a fair amount of Lakota phrases in my book. I don't always translate them. You know, sometimes I'll give like a little, you know, explanatory word or two. And so, you know, this is another burden, I think, on the native writer. It's like we have to decide how much are we going to translate for the non-native audience and how much not. So that's a fine line. And let me jump off here and sort of ask the question here. You and I both know that there's certainly been a change in native literature over the last few years. In fact, some people, Erica Worth, have called it the fourth wave of native literature, you know, and things are changing. You know, we've got our friend Stephen Graham Jones is killing with his book. Our mutual friend Tommy Orange. You know, we've got Kelly Jo Ford, our friend. We've got Rebecca Roanhorse. We've got people writing in genre. We've got people writing literary. We've got, you know, people doing stuff all over the map. So let me ask you, how do you feel? How is the landscape changing for native writers lately? Do you want to expand upon that?
I think it's exciting. It's very exciting. And your book, and if nobody's read Dave's book, Winter Counts, is a, you know, thriller. It's a crime thriller book. It's fantastic and really propulsive and urgent. And this is a debut for you. You know, I have written other books before that didn't address native issues, and part of that reason is my struggle with the colonization of, am I native enough to really talk about this stuff? You know, am I, you know, can I go in this area? And that's a real, you know, that comes out of that whole culture of colonization, you know, thinking, and it's very problematic. And so, you know, and until Where the Dead Sit Talking, you know, before then you know, I was just sort of doing some other stuff. So these last couple of books, you know, did I really want to begin and dig deep? But yes, so Dave's book, Kelly Jo Ford, who's Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, her book is amazing, called Crooked Hallelujah. Yeah, Tommy Orange is there. Stephen Graham Jones. There's this sort of renaissance. Erica Worth is, you know, a writer that I always tend to want to talk about, and is doing, you know, some very important work. And who else am I missing? That's, you know, Dave, Rebecca, you mentioned them. You know, there are so many writers out here who we haven't heard their voice. And so I feel like right now the landscape is changing, and people, you know, are getting away from the idea of saying, you know, are there two native writers that I could read? You know, I mean, or who who else is out there that I could read, and we're starting to see now, a wide range of good, we can call it a renaissance, right? Because I think that's what's happening. And this is a very, very good time for it, right? To speak specifically about the removed, and I think what we've been talking about is I included some of the old traditional Cherokee stories that an ancestor is telling. I wanted to include some of those old traditional stories. They were documented by a man named James Mooney, who was told stories. They came to Oklahoma orally, right? And he documented all these fantastic stories. And I thought I would really like to see these stories work in a modern Native story, right? And be referenced to, because the fear is erasure. And it's always the fear of is erasure, right? And so those old stories, I wanted to document, and also the historical element that led from the migration, what's known as the Trail of Tears. I wanted to incorporate those elements of suffering with a modern story of displacement and family really trying to heal through trauma, generational trauma. I wanted all those things to work and thread them together into one novel, right? And I think, and I apologize if I'm rambling here, but I feel like it's such an important topic that my curiosity is, are non-native readers more interested in the sort of traditional stories, than they are what's going on with the family, and I really tried to make those sort of parallel, if that makes sense.
Well, you anticipated one of my questions here. I wanted to ask you about some of the Cherokee myths that inspired certain sections of the novel, but I think you've really addressed that. And so let me kind of say, when I was writing Winter Counts, there were certain sections that were hard for me to write. In my book, I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but there's a young man, my protagonist is raising a young man named Nathan. He's 14. He overdoses on heroin. I wrote that scene. I'm a dad. I know you're a dad as well. That was a tough scene chapter for me to write, because obviously I'm drawing upon my own fears and panic. And was there a part of the novel that was more difficult for you to write?
Yes, I would say Sonia's sections were the most difficult for me. Only because, I'm as a fiction writer, right? We make choices, and here I wanted to write and show the violence against, in this case, domestic violence, that from a boyfriend toward a woman, and to really, it was really, really difficult I tried to get that as best as I could, and my editor was fantastic with helping me, but writing through that violence, the domestic violence, I think was extremely difficult, right? It's a very, very, it's all, I guess, in some way, it's all sensitive, but that specifically, writing through that domestic violence was especially difficult for me. Yeah.
Let me take that and jump off. I mean, I've known you for a while, and I know that you've had some day jobs, and one of them, correct me if I'm wrong, you were a social worker for a fair amount of time, isn't that right?
Yes.
And so, what is the impact of having actually been in the field as a social worker did you use that to inform the writing of the book? I'm assuming it's yes, but can you tell us how and more about it?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, my mom was a social worker. She's retired now, but that's sort of how I got into it. Is I needed a job with benefits. I mean, I was teaching at the time. Right before that, I taught for 2 years at this little school that paid, like $12,000, and I think the second year I got 14,000 the second year, and just it was these really rough, bad kids that, I mean, were disrespectful. I was just absolutely miserable, and not very good benefits, and then I was able to get a job. I just sort of, she was able to help me get a job in social work, and so I, that that's the route I took, and I did it for 7 years. And during that time, I mostly worked with youth, deprived youth, delinquent youth, and I'm using delinquent here because that's social work terminology, not my term, but the, 7 years through that, I began to really develop a deep sense of empathy for the foster care system, and for youth, and difficult, very very difficult job, and I eventually wanted to go back and do a PhD in creative writing. I needed the community, and so that's the reason I left. I knew I wanted to teach and work with, really pursue my passion, which is writing, and so I went on and did the doctorate. But that really informed Where the Dead Sit Talking, that Sequoia, and that comes out of a lot of that experience. I think Wyatt, in this book, is also comes out of that as well. So
I want to ask about Wyatt, because folks, go get this book. Okay, run, do not walk, and get this book. And when you get to the chapters with the character of Wyatt, I have a feeling that you're going to fall in love with this character as I did. So the character of Wyatt absolutely was one of my favorites in the book. And for if there are any writers out there, emerging writers, what Brandon does with the character of Wyatt is what I tell my students. So I am a professor of Native American Studies, but I do teach creative writing. I'm on the faculty of the MFA program at Western Colorado, and also at the Vermont College of Fine Arts. And I tell my students, surprise us with your characters, okay? And we talk a lot about first order motivations and second order motivations that, give your characters a motivation. Don't give them the obvious one, give them something different, surprise us. And Wyatt was constantly surprising me with the way he acted. He was delightful, he was quirky, and the music that he loved, the way that he related. Can you tell us a little bit about what inspired the drawing of Wyatt, who is just delightful?
just being around a lot of kids. I'm glad that you like Wyatt. Was really a joy to write about. He's such an eccentric little guy, little 12-year-old who I knew I wanted him to be eccentric, and to do these sort of, to be very different. Sequoia from Where the Dead Sit Talking was really very brooding and quiet. But Wyatt is I wanted an opposite of Sequoia, and so here comes Wyatt, and he feels like something out of the past, especially to Ernest, who's suffering from Alzheimer's disease. Wyatt comes in, this little boy carrying a briefcase full of Dean Martin records, and wearing saddle shoes, and feeling like something out of the 40s or 1950s, where he talks about being put in dance class, where he has to do various old dances, and his rhetoric is very sort of from the 50s, I guess, or just historical, and that has to do with my interest in memory for the book, and how important memory is, because on one hand, Ernest is losing his memory to Alzheimer's, right, and not being able to remember the little things, but on the other hand, Wyatt is sort of triggering something that is helping him remember and is functioning as a sort of healing mechanism, because he sees so much of his son Ray Ray, who was shot by a police officer. He sees that similarity, and it's almost as if Wyatt is channeling Ray Ray's spirit in some way, and that becomes a healing for Ernest's mind, And so, yeah, he was such a fun. I think Wyatt might show up again in something.
Oh,
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
so delighted to hear that,
yeah,
because when he exited the stage, I was like, oh, and
yeah.
so such a wonderfully drawn character. Trust me, folks. We've got about 10 minutes, and then folks, viewers, you will be able to give questions to both of us, so feel free to do that. So in the time that we have left, this is a little bit obscure. I don't think I've asked. You and I have talked about various things in some of the events we've done. I love the music references in this book. You just mentioned what Wyatt likes, but I was going through tonight, and I think I saw a lot of them. Tell me if I'm wrong. Isn't Elliott Smith mentioned in there, or am I wrong?
He is Elliott Smith, yes.
And isn't he was from Seattle, right? Portland, I guess.
Portland or Seattle. Someone else might know this. I think he's from. Well, actually, I think he was born in Dallas, Texas, but he moved to Seattle or Portland and really developed his music career before his tragic death.
Yeah, I am a music fan, and so in Winter Counts, I buried lots of music stuff in my book, and that was just really fun for me. And so when I was reading yours, I think I saw some Joy. I think I saw a reference to Joy Division. That one might have been in my head. Ornette Coleman, Cheap Trick, Scandinavian death metal, and a full couple of sentences on Neil Young, which really pleased me, as I am a Neil Young fanatic. Indeed, I wrote the last chapter of Winter Counts while under the influence of Tonight's the Night by Neil Young and the McDowell Colony. I listened to that album over and over and wrote the last bit. So I was just thrilled at the, it's just a fun thing to be able to put in some music references. Did I miss any, or was this, do you want to talk a little bit about the music in the book?
The only other ones I think are mentioned are Jimi Hendrix.
Oh yeah.
And Kurt Cobain, who are both rumored to play acoustic sets in the Darkening Land, right? As told to us by Venery, there's an owner of a record shop in the Darkening Land, kind of a hippie named Venery, which is where we get the word like venereal, right? This sort of sexual connotation, from Venery. And so those kinds of little subtle names and I mean, part of the fun of the Darkening Land was that it's a place that is mentioned in Cherokee mythology without really any kind of description, and that I was able to just sort of make this world my own. And in the context of this book, it's a place not much different than where we are right now in terms of pollution. I wanted to address climate change, people coughing dust, the polluted air, and then the racism that, again, like other members of the family, Edgar faces the threat of gun violence or of violence. Everybody has this sort of threat of, almost everybody, not Maria necessarily, but Sonia and Edgar have this threat of violence against them, and Edgar has this threat of being shot because Jackson Andrews, right, is developing a video game, a shooting video game, where natives are being shot at, and there are many stereotype references to Jim Thorpe, right, who's arguably one of the greatest athletes ever, so I wanted to use stereotype. I wanted to use that sort of police violence, because the whole thing began out of the question of, I was reading about police violence against Native teenagers. And that was, you know, and you and we talked about this just recently, but you know, that's really what really started, you know, the ideas were really sort of flashing after that. Cause I thought, you know, this needs to be written about. The Darkening Land is there's a fine line between absurdity, surrealness and absurdity, but I think there's a fine line between that and also how serious and threatening that and real, I hope, you know, in an absurd way, that land feels very real. A lot of my influences that I've been interested, people like Roberto Bolaño and William T. Vollmann are all interested in sort of Kathy Acker in writing about surreal situations. And so I realized that Edgar's sections feel way more absurd and surreal than a lot of the rest of the book, but that's purposeful.
There was such a, I don't want to give away any spoilers here, but those sections, there was such a disquieting sense, an eerie sense for those chapters that it's a tone that I don't see a lot in fiction. It was wonderfully, in fact, masterfully done. And so those chapters, you know, were just so well done and just left me with all sorts of questions and feelings. And so, you know, that's something that I really like about this book is I tell my students as well is vary your tone and your style. If it's grim all the time, you know, consider adding some moments of lightness, you know, add that. And this book accomplishes that wonderfully. But let me get to a question here. So did anything surprise you when you wrote this? When I wrote Winter Counts, which is about a native vigilante who beats up people for money that can't get justice, I had an idea of where the book was going to go, but I'm a big outliner, so I outlined it. But as I wrote it, it went in a slightly different direction. Did that happen with you? Did anything surprise you, or did it go in a different direction when you started writing it?
It did, right? And I don't outline. Which is probably, I mean, everybody does their own. The smart, organized way would be to outline something and then follow it. I have trouble doing that because I always go off in some other direction and into some sort of digression that, you know, I want to explore. And I think, well, this digress, yeah, this is a digression here, but you know, a lot of the fiction I really like to read is full of digressions, you know, and especially European literature. Right. I love European literature, but yes, I wrote this, and I think in terms of scenes, you know, and then I just sort of I think as I'm writing the scene, sometimes other things will, you know, this doors will open, lights will come on, and then it becomes, okay, we have to make choices as writers. And sometimes those choices are not the right choice, in which case we have to be able to recognize this is not propelling the story, right? It's not motivating the story anymore. So I need to put this either in the dumpster, you know, trash it, or put it into a chop file, and maybe I can use it for something else, right? Alexander Chee calls it a chop file, stuff that you just cut out and you think, well, this is pretty good, but it doesn't work for the story. And so, yeah, I just sort of let things happen, because I feel like the characters, once I know them, you know, they're going to sort of do what they do. If that's a weird answer, I know, but I mean, I like to write through it and see what happens.
Yeah.
Right. But I have to start with an image.
Sure.
And you know, this book, the first image that came to me was the family around a bonfire. You know, I
Mm.
saw the family around the bonfire, and so I mean, you know, um, I wish I were a better outliner, because I feel like it would, you know, it would probably make the whole process. Your book is, you know, from Virgil Wounded Horse is such a great character, you know. I mean, you know, it's this uh, this character is um, it feels so fully developed, and the voice, you know, his voice, and that's not easy to do. You know that. I mean, you know, we write through characters, and sometimes they don't have their own sort of distinct voice or characteristic. You really, I could tell you really had thought through Virgil's character. Yeah.
Well, I'll just say very quick word on that. So my book is written in first person, and so after I got done writing a 300-page novel in first, I said I will never write another book in first person. And then I talked to my publisher, and um, they said you will write another book in first person. And as I had signed a 2-book contract with them, and I'm actually thrilled, and I am writing the next one now. But let me talk about this, because we probably have time for one more question before we turn to our wonderful viewers. Um, you mentioned some of the literature that you like to read and that has influenced you, and I want to expand upon this. You mentioned European literature. You mentioned William T. Vollmann. I love Vollmann as well. I haven't read all of it. He's so prolific. You can't see it; it's just beyond the screen. But I'm one of the 500 people I have Rising Up and Rising Down, the 4,000-page novel that he wrote, or it's nonfiction. I have it up there. It's now a collector's item. I've been offered $1,000 for it, but
Oh wow!
hanging on.
Oh,
Yeah, I'm hanging on.
you have the original that
I do.
McSweeney's published, right?
Yes, that's right. I have it,
Oh, that's nice.
and
Yeah,
in good condition too. It's in mint. So,
oh.
yeah. So I like Vollmann as well. But tell us a little bit about some of the work. It could be native or non-native that influenced you, especially for our viewers who are, writers and developing their own aesthetic. What are some of the writers that you really loved and influenced you as you were developing your own style?
There are so many. I think, for one, again, Bolaño, in terms of the surreal, was an early, well, not an early influence, but certainly, I think stylistically, an influence on me. Kathy Acker is comes out of the, and unfortunately we lost her as well. We lost Bolaño to suicide, and we lost Kathy Acker. I think she died of breast cancer, I think, but she, in the 80s and early 90s, she was sort of part of that group with Vollmann and David Foster Wallace, and those, that came out of there's sort of the avant-garde group around that time. But also Dennis Johnson, Jesus' Son is a fantastic. But on a craft level, I could go on and I could go on and talk about so many. This is what I love doing. But Momaday as a craft, on a craft level, I get asked a lot about nature, why I like to sort of write about nature a lot, and I have to say that Inscott Momaday was probably one of the biggest influences on me, helping me understand and write about the earth, the landscape, the sky, right? And thinking in terms of images. And just a quick statement here is that actually one night in the late 90s, I got to meet Inscott Momaday. He was sitting in a restaurant in Oklahoma City eating by himself. And I was in there waiting for a friend of mine who I was waiting for him to get off work, and it was, I don't know, it was, midnight or 11:30, I don't know. And Inscott Momaday was over in the corner eating by himself, and I went over and met him, and I'm sure just, slobbered all over everywhere, because that was a long time ago, but just really is sort of a hero of mine, and just a beautiful, beautiful writer.
Wonderful. Well, let me, Stesha, I know you're there. I want to give folks a chance to ask Brandon some questions. I can't see it, but I see that something has popped up in Q&A, and there you are. Hello.
Hello, how's it going? That's a great conversation you've been having, and I've been having fun putting links for folks in the chat so that they can follow up and read some of those amazing writers you've been talking about. So actually, I wanted to mention we have a really lovely comment in the chat first. So let me see if I can pull that up. That came in. Well, actually, you know what? I'll look for that while I give you a minute to process this conversation. So when you were talking about the Darkening Land, you talked about the mix of seriousness and absurdity, which I think is especially interesting since it starts out seeming so normal, there are quotation marks, and in many ways very much is. I'd love to hear more about how seriousness and humor, concrete reality, and surrealism operated for you in some of the other chapters, for example, Sonia and the Rain, or Wyatt's role to Maria and Ernest. And then in parentheses, it says, as a non-Indigenous POC, it was interesting to me to read reviews by white people who called this magical, again in quotation marks, and imaginary, or who didn't get the Darkening Land. The surrealness of some of the other chapters felt pretty true to how I might make sense of my own grief, for instance, understanding events like meeting Wyatt or seeing an auspicious animal in a time of grief. I'd also love to hear any thoughts on how your work has been reviewed or interpreted so far.
Thank you for that question. And it's certainly problematic, I think, to use the word magical. Dave, would you, I mean, we hear these terms like magical realism when we talk about Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who, by the way, was also a sort of influence on me. He's a beautiful writer. But that falls into that sort of line of thinking that we began talking about, is that there's this sort of stereotype that, becomes magical, and and in some ways it feels very, it's very frustrating to try to work through that. The Darkening Land is a place. I don't know that there's anything that's magical about it, though, in the book and in the old traditional stories. It's that seems to reference to where one goes after death until justice is served. And then once justice is served, one is able to leave the magical, the Darkening Land. But the magical element, the magical remark that's made, to those things are it's, that's what we want to, I think that's what we really want to try to get away from and get people to sort of work through. But there's a fine line between also that I'm really interested in writing about what's sad and what's humorous, right? And have you ever been to a reading and someone, barrels out with laughter, and that someone's reading, and then other people sort of chuckle too. And then you wonder, was that really supposed to be funny, or was it supposed to be sad, right? Sometimes we don't, we can't discern the sad, but I'm really interested in that, right? In that effect, because, that's something that feels to me, that is a challenge in discernment, right? And so I don't think that there's anything necessarily humorous in that happened in this novel, in The Darkening Land. I do want to point to absurdity, right? And the surreal element to it. For example, there's a red fowl that follows Edgar around everywhere. And, that in a way is a sort of metaphor for his addiction, and if you've, the old bird, right? That sort of addiction that we carry, or that those, people often carry So it becomes a metaphor. And there was so much attention to the landscape, the sort of cryptic, darkening landscape, right? That in the darkening land, that I felt like it, that sort of metaphor becomes very real, So, so yeah. I mean, I'm referencing the old traditional stories here, but I don't know if I'm answering the question. Am I?
I think you have. Yeah, I
Okay.
think so.
Dave,
Yeah.
Dave might.
I'd love to jump in because that was such a wonderfully phrased question, and there was a lot in there. So thank you, whoever submitted it. It was
Anonymous.
really, yeah. Thank you. And so, Brandon, the question at the end was the thought about reviews.
Oh, yeah.
And so, I will share with you to set this up that I do read my professional reviews, like in the newspapers and such. I certainly don't read the Goodreads reviews and all that, just because I feel that that's not for writers, that's for readers. And I think there are 9,000 of them in my book anyway, so I'm certainly not going to go through and read those. How do you feel about the reviews you've read? I think the question was specifically that non-native people were reviewing. Do you want to address that? Do you read them? And if so, how do you feel about them? I think they've been pretty positive.
I've read them because they're usually sent to me, like the LA Times and USA Today, NPR all gave very glowing reviews that I'm very, very proud of, right? Yeah, it's the other stuff that becomes, a little bit frustrating, but on some level, we as writers, we have to shrug that stuff off. It's not easy. And what I used to do back in the days before, when I used to submit stories, and I would get the rejection slips, that came in the mail. I remember when I was in my 20s, I would plaster those all over my wall, and tape them up. And a teacher told me to do that once. And the reason for that is because the more you sort of desensitize to it, right? So in a way, I mean, there's sort of that idea of, I like to desensitize to things. So, because they lose their power. And it's real avoidant behavior to think, oh no, I'm not going to. People will often say that, don't, and Dave, I'm with you. I don't anymore want to go on Goodreads at all, or look at those those comments. But on the other hand, it is good to get some really sharp criticism, because it does, at some point, as a writer, most of what we hear is critical, right? Even for the good stuff. You wrote a brilliant novel, or you write a brilliant short story, but I just didn't quite follow, or whatever that little moment is. And it becomes, Dave and I teaching, writing workshops, there's something about, how much do we silence? I don't like to, and I know Dave and I are on the same page in this, right? We don't like to silence students. That comes out of a, kind of an old traditional, I like to let students speak for themselves. So my workshops are usually, right, filled with all kinds of conversations, only because I don't like to silence people. And so yeah, I mean, this is a very long-winded answer, right? But I'm all for desensitizing to criticism, right? But at the same time, I don't like it.
I'll piggyback off of that, and then we'll let, if there are other questions, I want to give them a chance. But I'm interested in that technique. And anybody that's watching this, I want to be clear. I so appreciate the Goodreads reviews. I just, get and thrilled. Thank you if anybody has done that, good or bad. I appreciate you weighing in. I just have too much of a thin skin to read them. I read one by accident once at a blog post or something, and somebody said about my book, this is a great novel for members of the Jason Bateman fan club. And to this day, I really don't understand what that means. I
Oh.
like Jason Bateman. And so I embrace it. So Slacker Steve, if you're out there, I want to let you know that I appreciated the review, and I think Jason Bateman does as well. So thank you, Slacker Steve. So anyway, I know, weird, right? So do we have others? Because if not, I have a whole bunch that I'd love to ask Brandon.
We have a couple more here, but I am going to read one lovely comment that somebody put in pretty early on in the program. MP says, "Just want to voice my great appreciation for this and acknowledgement that we are here in the audience, listening and enthusiastic. It must be weird not seeing faces as you would in an auditorium or bookstore. The Removed is one of my favorite books I've read in a long time, and I'm grateful to take in this work of art in tonight's conversation. And I also had siblings who went to Metro State. Much gratitude and care to both of you for your work." So I wanted to share that with you because that's just a lovely reminder that there are people on the other end of the digital waves here. So we
Thank
have
you.
So we have a question from Celeste, and Celeste says, "I'm so curious about your imagined audience. Both of you have young characters. Could you talk about potential young and adult readers and how they might read things differently?"
Good, yeah. Well, I'll start here. To be honest, when I'm working, when I'm writing on something, I don't think too much about audience because it paralyzes me too much. I don't know if you're like that, Dave, but I start thinking about, what my aunt or what my ninth grade algebra teacher, who attends the First Christian Church, those kind of people, like all those people, like, oh no, they're gonna, and then that becomes very paralyzing. So if there is a reader that I think of when I'm working, it is someone very much identical to myself, right? In a way, I'm entertaining myself, and I always talk about that. I feel like it's very important to find the pleasure in writing. That is what really motivates, and we can feel that. When I read Dave's Winter Counts, I can tell, how you can feel the energy in that book, and I think that the passion that we can feel it burns off the page when we're reading it often, and in many books and I think that the minute that that you lose that sort of pleasure or that sense of this is enjoyment, what I'm doing here, I'm creating art, I'm writing this stuff that feels very important to me. The minute it starts to feel too much like work, it starts to feel dead and lifeless, right? And then that's the stuff that we don't want, probably to keep. And so, the work sort of comes later on when you're revising and editing, but early on, and I'm talking about the early drafting stuff. So I always try to think of myself as the reader. I think it was, wasn't it Toni Morrison who said, write the book that you most want to read? And, and I've always felt that's what I'm trying to do. What about you, Dave?
I feel that as well. I don't think of the audience when I'm writing. And I just, the other part of that question was, how do we feel about writing for younger readers?
Oh, yeah.
And I think that yours might very well be for a younger audience. I can certainly say to anybody out there, do not let anybody read Winter Counts that is younger than, let's say, 16, because my book is violent and it also has a lot of profanity. I did a search. I have 137 uses of the F word in there. So, just to be but who's counting, and so I just want to be clear here that I would cut it off at 16, but The Removed, I could see a sophisticated 14-year-old or 13-year-old reading this. That's my thought. So I don't know.
Well, I would hope a young reader, certainly high school for sure, I think could handle it. Absolutely. I just don't think too much. I think if you start to think of it, a reader that's too young, then it sort of loses its you know, I think you start to want to explain too much. And that comes back to, you know, there's so much that doesn't need to be explained, right? Let the reader figure it out themselves.
Agreed.
Well, gentlemen, we are at 7 o'clock, so I would think it's probably time to wrap it up. But I wanted to see if, David, if you had any last questions for Brandon, any final thoughts from either of you before we head out into the evening.
Well, just the final thoughts. I always like to end these things. If there's a book recommendation that people like to give of something that's coming out, or you know, so I'll, you know, just so readers can get out there. We've talked a lot about books tonight. I'll give two. So if people are listening out there, and they want to learn more about Native issues, my friend David Troyer wrote a nonfiction book called The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee. I think 2019. It also was nominated for the National Book Award in nonfiction. It is superb. It is the most accessible history book I've ever seen. It is great. I've got an interview with him coming out in Roundup magazine in a month or two. So I'll just recommend that. And Brandon, just as a final thought, do you have anything that you would want to recommend to viewers?
We often don't recommend poetry, but my friend Sherwin Bitsui is a Native poet. There are two poets that Sherwin Bitsui is one, and Layli Long Soldier. We haven't at all mentioned Layli Long Soldier's poetry, and she's a Native writer, and won. Dave, correct me here. She won a PEN Award a few years ago for her book, Whereas, and I want to recommend those two, because I feel like poetry I never recommend, and they're always on my mind, those two, just beautiful writers and beautiful books. So yeah.
All right.
I love that. I've put links to their books in the chat as well. And we had the pleasure at the library of hosting David Troyer for our Bullet Lecture in American History. I think 2 years ago it was. And I'm not sure if there's still a recording up on the library's website, but I'll see if I can track that down. But anyway, thanks to both of you so much. This has been such an interesting conversation, a fun conversation, and it's just a joy to spend a little time with both of you. So thanks for being here. We are just excited to encourage you to read Brandon's new book, The Removed, or David's book, Winter Counts. They're both available in print or digital formats through the library, and our website is spl.org. or from our friends at the wonderful Elliott Bay Book Company. Elliott Bay is open for limited browsing or for curbside delivery, curbside pickup or delivery. And as I mentioned at the top of the event, they also have signed book plates from both Brandon and David. So if you want to get assigned a book plate, you can put that in the order form when you're ordering your book. And their website is elliottbaybook.com. So thanks to both of you for being here tonight and inspiring us. We're also grateful to our sponsors, the Seattle Public Library Foundation, the Gary and Connie Kunis Foundation, and the Seattle Times. And of course, we're so grateful to our colleagues over at Elliott Bay Book Company for partnering with us tonight. And of course, thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Rick. Thanks everyone for showing up and listening. Dave, thanks. Appreciate it, man.
Thank you, Brandon.
Yeah. Good night.
Bye-bye all.
All right. Bye-bye.